Sydney had men who ordered violence, men who made millions from the city's darkest streets, and men who disappeared the moment someone came looking for them. But Semi Ngata was different. Known to many as Tongan Sam, he spent years standing beside one of the most recognizable figures in Sydney's nightlife world, John Ibrahim. He wasn't the man sitting behind the desk. He was the man standing beside the door, the man watching the room, the man expected to step in when things turned violent. For years, that loyalty made him valuable. But on one night in November 2017, it may have made him a target. It was the night before a major Ibrahim family wedding, and inside a quiet Maryland's neighborhood, something was already waiting in the darkness. At around 10:45 that night, Tongan Sam was outside a family home when a gunman struck, one shot, straight into his back. The attacker disappeared. The getaway car was later found burned out. Weapons were recovered, and investigators eventually discovered that the shooter may not have been working alone. But here's where the story gets darker. Tongan Sam survived, and despite everything that happened that night, the biggest question remained unanswered. Who wanted him dead? Was it a personal betrayal? A feud from Sydney's underworld? A warning aimed at the Ibrahim family? Or had Tongan Sam finally become the target because of the very world he had spent years protecting? This is not simply the story of a shooting. It's the story of a man who built his reputation on loyalty, a man who survived a bullet that was meant to silence him, and a mystery that, years later, still refuses to disappear. Before the gunshot, before the burned out Subaru, before his name became attached to one of Sydney's most mysterious underworld shootings, there was a man who had spent years standing in the shadows. His name was Semi Ngata, but to Sydney, he became known as Tongan Sam. And if you only know him because of the bullet that nearly killed him in 2017, you're missing the most important part of the story. Because Tongan Sam didn't suddenly appear on the night of the Maryland's ambush. His reputation had been built over years. Long before that backyard became a crime scene, Ngata had already become a familiar figure around one of Sydney's most notorious nightlife names, John Ibrahim. The two were closely associated for years, with Ngata serving as Ibrahim's longtime bodyguard. And this wasn't the kind of job where a man simply stood outside a nightclub door. In Ibrahim's world, being close meant being exposed. King's Cross was a place where money, nightlife, celebrities, and organized crime allegations could exist within the same few streets. And during those years, Ibrahim's name became increasingly associated with the Cross. Ngata was the man who stayed close. He was there as the nightlife empire grew. He was there through the years when Ibrahim became one of the most recognizable figures in Sydney's club scene. And eventually, that loyalty became part of Ngata's identity. John Ibrahim later described him as a brother to the family. That single description tells us something important. Tongan Sam wasn't simply an employee. He had become part of the inner circle. But there was another side to that life. The closer you stand to powerful people, the more danger can follow you home. And by the end of the 2000s, Ngata's name was appearing in another kind of headline. In 2009, he was arrested after a raid on his home by a specialist gang task force, uncovered quantities of a methamphetamine precursor. That did not make him a convicted drug trafficker, and it is important not to turn an arrest into a conviction. But it showed something about the environment surrounding him. Tongan Sam was no longer simply known as the man standing beside John Ibrahim. His own name was beginning to appear in the records. Then came a far more serious allegation. In 2011, Ngata was charged alongside Sam Ibrahim and others over an alleged kidnapping and extortion plot. The allegation involved an attempt to extort $100,000 from a man. For a time, the case placed Tongan Sam directly inside one of the most serious criminal investigations surrounding the Ibrahim circle. But the ending was very different from what a headline might suggest. In February 2012, the NSW Director of Public Prosecutions withdrew the kidnapping charges. There was no conviction, and that distinction matters, because the story of Tongan Sam isn't simply a list of criminal accusations. It's a story about a man whose life became increasingly intertwined with Sydney's underworld, while some of the most serious allegations against him never resulted in a conviction. And through all of it, one thing remained remarkably consistent: his loyalty to the Ibrahim family. For years, Ngata occupied a position that few outsiders could understand. He wasn't the face of the business. He wasn't the man whose name appeared on nightclub signs. He wasn't sitting at the center of the spotlight. He was the man beside the spotlight, watching, protecting, and staying close. That position came with an unusual kind of power. You didn't need to own the room if everyone knew who you were standing beside, but it also came with a price. Because when violence finally came looking for the Ibrahim family, it didn't stop at the front door. It reached the man standing closest to them. And in November 2017, after years of loyalty, Tongan Sam would discover just how dangerous that position could become. The next chapter would begin with a family wedding. But before the first guest arrived, someone had already decided that a gun needed to be fired. There was a time when you could walk through Sydney's King's Cross and understand very quickly who mattered. The lights were bright, the clubs were full, money moved quickly, and behind the glamour was a world built on reputation, loyalty, and fear. This was the environment in which John Ibrahim became one of the most recognizable names in Sydney's nightlife. And somewhere close to him was Semi Ngata, not in front of the cameras, not looking for attention, always nearby, always watching. That position might look simple from the outside, but in a place like King's Cross, standing beside someone powerful meant becoming part of the atmosphere around them. And Tongan Sam seemed to understand that better than most. His job was not to become the star. His job was to make sure the man beside him could move through the room safely. That meant nightclubs, private functions, crowded streets, late nights, and a constant awareness that a normal night could turn violent in seconds. For years, Ngata remained one of the people trusted to stay close to Ibrahim, and that relationship became unusual, because bodyguards come and go, employees leave, associates change sides, but Ngata stayed. Year after year, that loyalty became one of the defining parts of his public image. By the time the 2010s arrived, Tongan Sam was no longer simply a man working security. He had become a recognizable figure in his own right. People knew the name, they knew who he stood beside, and they understood that his connection to the Ibrahim family went back years. John Ibrahim himself later described Ngata as being like a brother to the family. That tells us just how far the relationship had moved beyond an ordinary employer and employee arrangement. But there was another reason Ngata's position mattered. He was close enough to see the danger before it reached the man he was protecting. And Sydney's nightlife world was changing. The old King's Cross was slowly disappearing. The clubs, the characters, and the street culture that had defined the area for decades were being pushed into a different era. But the relationships built during those years did not simply disappear. Neither did the reputation. For Tongan Sam, the transition meant something important. The man who had spent years standing beside John Ibrahim had become part of the history surrounding him. Even the television drama inspired by Ibrahim's autobiography would later bring the character of Tongan Sam back into the public spotlight, with actor Yuli Latukafu portraying him in Last King of the Cross. But television is one thing. The real story was far less glamorous. Because behind the nightclub, lights was a simple reality. Being close to powerful people can make you powerful, but it can also make you a target. And by the end of the 2000s, Tongan Sam's own name had begun appearing in serious criminal investigations. The 2009 raid on his home brought another layer to the story. Then came the kidnapping allegations in 2011. For a man whose public identity had been built around loyalty and protection, these episodes showed that his life was no longer confined to the nightclub doors. But none of those events would define the moment that changed his story forever. That moment was still years away, because despite the headlines, the allegations, and the changing face of Sydney's underworld, Tongan Sam remained close to the Ibrahim family, and that loyalty would continue right up until the night when someone decided to test it. By November 2017, the relationship had lasted for years. The setting, however, was no longer King's Cross. It was a quiet suburban street in Marylands, and there was a wedding coming, a family wedding. Guests were preparing. The night was supposed to be about celebration, but somewhere outside that house, another plan was already taking shape. A stolen car, a gun, and a group of people who were about to drive toward the Ibrahim family home. Tongan Sam had spent years protecting other people from danger. Now, for the first time, the danger was coming directly for him. By November 2017, the Ibrahim family was preparing for a celebration. The location was a family home on Price Street in Marylands. The following day, the house was expected to become the center of a high-profile wedding. There were preparations everywhere: chairs, a marquee, deliveries. names written outside the property. Everything pointed toward a celebration. But on the night of November 17th, nobody was thinking about a shooting. Not yet. Because from the outside, this looked like an ordinary family gathering before a major event. Then, at around 10:45 p.m., everything changed. Semi Ngata was outside the house, and somewhere in the darkness around the property, another person was moving. According to investigators, the attacker may have entered through the side of the property before opening fire. Ngata was struck by a bullet in the back. One shot. Then the gunman disappeared. There was no dramatic confrontation caught on camera, no long exchange of gunfire, just a sudden attack in the darkness, and a man left seriously wounded. Ngata was rushed to Westmead Hospital. His condition was serious but stable. He required surgery, but he survived. And that survival would become one of the most important parts of the story, because whoever had planned the attack had apparently chosen a very specific moment. The house was connected to John Ibrahim. The target was a man who had spent years protecting the Ibrahim family. And the attack happened less than a day before a wedding that was about to bring two prominent Sydney families together. The timing was impossible to ignore, but timing is not proof of motive. Authorities were careful about that distinction. They confirmed the shooting was targeted, but they did not establish publicly that the upcoming wedding was the reason for the attack. That uncertainty would follow the case for years. And then there was something else. The attack had not ended when the gunman left the property. Somewhere nearby, a getaway operation was already underway. A dark blue Subaru WRX had been stolen weeks earlier. Not long after the shooting, that car would be found burned out on Reese Street in nearby Maze Hill. It was as if whoever had planned the attack understood that the vehicle could become evidence, and wanted it destroyed before anyone could trace it back. But fire doesn't always erase a crime. Sometimes it leaves behind a trail. And in this case, the trail was about to become much bigger, because investigators would eventually discover that the gunman may not have been acting alone. There were other vehicles, other people, and a getaway plan that stretched beyond the Maryland's house. But before investigators could reconstruct what happened, the family had to face an extraordinary decision. The wedding was still scheduled. Less than 24 hours after a man had been shot outside the property, guests were arriving. The same house that had become a crime scene was now being prepared for a celebration. And despite the violence of the previous night, the wedding went ahead. The contrast was almost surreal. Outside, the media gathered. Inside, preparations continued. The family tried to move forward. But for Tongan Sam, the night had changed everything. He had survived. But somebody had come onto that property with a gun and fired directly at him. The question was no longer whether the shooting had been planned. The evidence suggested that it had. The real question was much darker. Who had planned it? And how had they managed to disappear so quickly? The answer would begin with a car, a stolen Subaru, a burning street, and a trail of evidence that investigators would spend months trying to piece together. Because the shooter may have pulled the trigger alone, but he almost certainly didn't escape alone. The gunman had fired. Tongan Sam was fighting for his life, but the people behind the attack weren't finished. They still had one problem, the escape. A shooting in a quiet suburban street was one thing. Leaving behind a stolen car, witnesses and a trail of evidence was another. And whoever planned this operation appeared to understand that the getaway vehicle could become the first major clue. The vehicle was a dark metallic, blue Subaru WRX. But this wasn't a car that had simply appeared on the street that night. It had already been stolen. 3 weeks before the shooting, the WRX had been taken from a property in Pimulwui, and it wasn't the only Subaru stolen from that location. A second vehicle was taken at the same time. That second car was later recovered in Maryland's. The WRX, however, would have a very different ending, because after the shooting, it was driven toward Maze Hill. And there, on Reese Street, the operation took a dramatic turn. The people inside the vehicle got out. For a moment, the car sat abandoned on the street. Then someone went back and set it on fire. What happened next was captured by CCTV. The footage showed a group of people around the vehicles. At least 6 people were visible in the area. One vehicle eventually drove away. The WRX remained. Then the flames appeared, and according to investigators, the fire was so intense that the person who ignited it may have suffered burns. The flames didn't simply consume the car. They exploded upward, turning a stolen vehicle into a burning shell in the middle of a suburban street. But there was something investigators noticed in that footage. The group didn't simply abandon the scene in confusion. They appeared to have a plan. One vehicle left. Another remained further down the street. And after the WRX was well alight, a Toyota Hilux was seen further away. The picture was becoming clearer. This wasn't looking like one gunman escaping in one car. It looked more like a coordinated operation. Someone had to get the shooter to Maryland's. Someone had to get people away from the scene. Someone had to deal with the vehicle. And someone had to make sure the vehicle could no longer be easily traced. By May 2018, investigators publicly revealed just how much larger the operation appeared to be. They believed the shooter had been assisted by 5 other people. 5. That meant the attack involved a network of people performing different roles. The shooter may have been the person who pulled the trigger, but someone had organized the movement, someone had arranged the vehicles, and someone was prepared to destroy the evidence afterwards. Then came another clue: the guns. 2 pistols were recovered from a nearby property in Mays Hill following the shooting. Whether either weapon was the one used against Ngata became part of the forensic investigation, but the discovery added another layer to an already complicated scene, because now investigators weren't looking at one location, they were looking at a chain: Maryland's, the getaway route, Mays Hill, the burned Subaru, the weapons, the people captured on CCTV, and the vehicles moving through the darkness. Every piece mattered, but the most unusual clue may have been the fire itself. Investigators believe the person who ignited the WRX could have suffered burns to their hands, arms, and possibly face. So months after the shooting, they were still asking a very specific question: who suddenly turned up with unexplained burns around November 17th? It was a remarkably simple clue. But if the theory was correct, the person who helped destroy the getaway car may have carried a physical reminder of the crime. And that meant the investigation wasn't only about finding someone who had seen the shooting. It was also about finding someone who might have noticed an injured friend, a burned associate, or a person suddenly hiding fresh injuries. Yet despite the complexity of the operation, one thing remained missing: the person who actually pulled the trigger. The CCTV showed people, it showed vehicles, it showed the destruction of the WRX, but it didn't provide the final answer. And the more investigators reconstructed the getaway, the stranger the original shooting became, because someone had gone to Maryland's with a clear objective, someone had arranged an escape, someone had helped destroy the evidence, and at least 6 people appeared to have been involved in the aftermath. Yet the man they had targeted was still alive. Tongan Sam had survived the bullet, the Subaru had burned, the weapons had been recovered, the trail was there, but the identity of the shooter remained hidden behind the darkness of that November night. And now the investigation faced its biggest obstacle: not a burned car, not a missing weapon, not even a lack of clues, something much harder to break: silence. By now investigators had pieces of the puzzle: a burned out Subaru, CCTV footage, multiple people, 2 pistols, and evidence suggesting the gunman had help getting away. But there was one thing they couldn't recover from a crime scene: an answer. Semi Ngata survived the shooting, but according to contemporary reporting, he did not cooperate with investigators about what had happened, and that created a strange situation. The man who had been shot was alive, the evidence existed, the getaway operation had left traces, yet one of the people best positioned to explain what happened was saying very little. That silence mattered, because without knowing what Ngata had seen, who he believed had attacked him, or whether he had any idea why he had been targeted, investigators were left trying to reconstruct the motive from everything around him, and the clues raised more questions than answers. Why target Tongan Sam? Was he the intended target, or was the attack meant to send a message to someone else? Did the gunman have a personal reason? Was it connected to the Ibrahim family's wider world? Or was there something about Ngata's own past that had finally caught up with him? There was no publicly established answer, and that is what makes the Maryland's shooting so unusual. The attackers left behind evidence, but not an explanation. The Subaru could be burned, weapons could be recovered, CCTV could be examined, but motive was harder to destroy than evidence. And as the months passed, one fact remained impossible to ignore. Someone had gone looking for Tongan Sam. They found him, they shot him, and somehow, they disappeared. But the shooting wasn't the only dark chapter in Ngata's life, because while the Maryland's attack remained unresolved, his name would soon appear in the headlines again. And this time, Tongan Sam wasn't the victim. Tongan Sam had survived the bullet, but surviving an assassination attempt didn't mean his life suddenly became quiet. Less than 2 years later, his name was back in the headlines. This time, there was no dark backyard, no masked gunman, no burning getaway car. It was broad daylight in Maryland's. In April 2019, Ngata was accused of crashing his Jeep into several parked cars. Witnesses described the vehicle hitting 2 cars before continuing onto another street, where it allegedly struck another vehicle. The Jeep was eventually abandoned. Ngata was arrested and faced 6 charges, including drink, driving, and dangerous driving. But just 3 months later, the story took another turn. In July, police arrested Ngata at his Maryland's home over an unauthorized pistol. The firearm was a loaded Bodyguard pistol, originally found months earlier inside the glove box of a Nissan Patrol. Investigators alleged forensic evidence linked the weapon to Ngata. Again, these were charges and allegations, not proof of guilt. And that distinction matters, because by 2019, Tongan Sam's public story had become almost impossible to define with a single label. He had been a trusted bodyguard. He had faced serious allegations. He had survived a shooting, and now he was facing new charges. But none of these events answered the question that had been hanging over him since 2017. Who shot Tongan Sam? The man had survived. The getaway car had been destroyed. The trail had gone cold. And while Ngata's life continued to make headlines, the person who had tried to end it remained in the shadows. For years, Tongan Sam's story existed mostly in the shadows. The shooting was remembered. His name was remembered. But the man behind the name was becoming harder to separate from the legend. Then, years later, something changed. Tongan Sam began appearing in a new generation of stories about Sydney's underworld. His name had survived the era that created it, and now it was being rediscovered by people who hadn't even been there when King's Cross was at its most notorious. That renewed attention wasn't entirely accidental. The story had everything modern true crime audiences are drawn to: a feared reputation, a powerful association, a mysterious shooting, a survivor, and a question that still had no satisfying public answer. But there was another reason the name became familiar again. The world that surrounded John Ibrahim was eventually dramatized in the series Last King of the Cross. Actor Yuli Latukafu portrayed Tongan Sam in the series, bringing the character to a completely new audience. But there is an important difference between a television character and the real man. Television needs heroes, villains, conflict, clean storylines. Real life doesn't. The real Semi Ngata lived through complicated relationships, allegations, violence, and years of public attention without ever receiving a neat ending, and that's why his story remains so difficult to define. To some, he was a loyal protector who stayed beside the Ibrahim family for years. To others, his name became associated with the darker side of Sydney's underworld. And to the public, perhaps the most enduring image is the simplest one. Asterisk asterisk the man who was shot in the back and survived. In 2026, renewed reporting once again brought attention to Ngata and the Maryland's shooting. But even with the passing of time, the central mystery remained remarkably unchanged. There was still no publicly established explanation that could answer every question surrounding the attack. No definitive motive that settled the story. No ending worthy of a crime novel. Just a survivor, and a mystery that refused to die. And perhaps that's why Tongan Sam's name has lasted. Not because every part of his story is known, but because some of the most important parts still aren't. For years, Semi Ngata stood beside powerful people. He watched doors. He watched crowds. He watched the men who came looking for trouble. And somewhere along the way, the man known as Tongan Sam became part of the world he was supposed to protect. But every life built around loyalty eventually faces one question. What happens when loyalty makes you a target? On the night of November 17, 2017, someone came looking for Tongan Sam. They found him in Maryland's. A gun was fired into his back. The attacker disappeared. The getaway car was destroyed. Weapons were recovered, and investigators uncovered evidence suggesting the operation involved several people. But the most important thing was something nobody could take away. He survived. Years later, there is still no simple answer to the question that has followed this story from the beginning. Who wanted Tongan Sam dead? Was it an old feud? A personal betrayal? A warning? something connected to the world he had spent decades moving through? Or was the real reason known only to the people who were there that night? We may never know, and perhaps that's the most haunting part of the story. Because the fire destroyed the car, the bullet almost destroyed a life. Time erased some of the evidence, but it couldn't erase the question. Tongan Sam's story is not the story of an untouchable man. It's the story of a man who spent years standing close to power, and eventually discovered that standing close to danger comes with a price. He survived the night that was supposed to end his story, but the mystery surrounding that night never received the same ending. And somewhere in Sydney's history, the Maryland's ambush remains frozen in time. A quiet street, a family preparing for a wedding, a gunshot in the darkness, a burning car, and a man who refused to disappear. Tongan Sam Ngata survived the bullet, but whoever pulled the trigger left behind a question that still has no definitive public answer. And sometimes, the most powerful ending to a true crime story is the one that never came. If you found this story interesting, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more real Australian true crime documentaries, because some stories are forgotten, others refuse to die.